In our last study, we focused on Revelation 1:10, and we spent a lot of time on the first part of the verse, specifically when John says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day." And we discussed in that study how the translation of the Greek into English seems to be affected by our traditional understanding of the Lord's Day. Because from the late 2nd century to present, the Lord's Day has come to mean Sunday. So the translators, when they were translating the King James, they came to the Greek there and they thought that it was Sunday, and so they rendered the Greek accordingly. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, to them meaning I was in the Spirit on Sunday. And we discussed how a more literal translation of the Greek would be I was in the Spirit in the Lord's Day, because that Greek word is translated in everywhere throughout the entire book of Revelation except right there where it's translated on in almost all English translations that I'm aware of. So from there, if we were to understand it in that way, I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day, that would take us to the Old Testament, because in that day is one of the ways the prophets would refer to the day of the Lord. So from there, we discussed the Lord's day and what John did and didn't mean by it. So in this study, I want to do a brief follow-up, a part 2, because some people and even some scholars cite the Didache to support their view that the Lord's Day in Revelation 1:10 means Sunday. And I don't believe the Didache supports the Sunday interpretation. So I just want to make this video to address that in case that comes up. When people are listening to part 1, if they're familiar with the Didache, they might be thinking, why didn't I address the Didache? And I did not address it in the first study, part 1, but we are going to address it here. So there are multiple English translations now of the Didache, and they differ pretty wildly, in my opinion. They're not. There's not a singular English translation. I guess just like the New Testament, there are translations that are more literal, translations that are more loose, and so forth. So I'm going to read 5 different English translations, and it's only the first part of chapter 14, verse 1. So it's not a whole lot that we're going to be going through here. So 5 different English translations of the Didache 14:1. So the first option, on the Lord's day of the Lord, come together, break bread, and hold Eucharist. Another option, but every Lord's day, gather yourselves together and break bread and give thanksgiving. Another option, and on the Lord's own day, gather yourselves together and break bread and give thanks. Now the next one actually has a translator's header. Like many of our Bibles will have little headers that are just the translator's way of helping us understand what they think is going on in the passage. So this one, in this English translation, the translators of the Didache have the header, the Sabbath assembly. So that gives away right there what they think is going on. They don't think it's Sunday because the Sunday is not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is Saturday. So they translate it, after giving the header of the Sabbath assembly, they translate it every day, gather together, eat a meal, and give thanks. And that one's very different from the ones that went before. And the last one here, now according to the Lord's day, gather together and break bread and give thanks. So if we're listening closely and reading these, the first one, on the Lord's day of the Lord. Does that make sense? Not particularly. And the last one, now according to the Lord's day, and in that one, day is in italics because they had to supply that word because, as we'll find out, day, the word day in Greek is not in the Didache text. But according to the Lord's something, gather together, break bread, and give thanks. So that brings us to, I have a couple scholars here that we're going to go through what they have to say about that. But in doing these studies, I've been reading through quite a few academic commentaries. I think the number is somewhere between like around maybe 7 or 8, maybe 9 now. And I noticed that Greg Beale, who's written one of the famous Revelation commentaries, Buist Fanning, and Grant Osborne, all three of them are supporters of the Sunday view for Revelation 1:10. Yet none of those scholars mention the Didache at all, nor do they mention Ignatius's letter to the Magnesians. Now, Ignatius's letter to the Magnesians is one of the things we focused on in part 1. So if you're unfamiliar with that, I would encourage you to go listen to part 1 if somehow you stumbled into part 2 here without part 1. And I will link part 1 in the description. But so neither Beale, nor Fanning, nor Osborne, all supporters of the Sunday view, mention the Didache at all. Now, I don't know why they don't mention it. My speculation is because they know that these texts, both the Didache and Ignatius to the Magnesians, don't contain the word day in the Greek text. So to use those, or to try to use those manuscripts, those writings, to support Sunday doesn't work because, again, the Greek texts of the Didache do not contain the Greek word for day. So I thought that was interesting that those scholars who do support the Sunday position don't even try to use the Didache. I think that's significant that they don't. So a couple scholars here. The first one is named Ranko Stefanovic, and I will link his article in the description. He is a Seventh-day Adventist, so he does have a bias here. He doesn't want Revelation 1:10 to be about Sunday because they believe we should be worshiping on Saturday. But that being the case, his personal opinions shouldn't affect our interaction with his scholarship. So the scholarship that he does either stands or falls based on the peer review process and the scholarship he's doing, whether or not he himself is Seventh-day Adventist. One of the scholars that I read is a Catholic. There are Calvinist scholars and open theist scholars. So the scholarship stands or falls based on the quality of the scholarship, not based on the personal views that the scholar holds. So I just want to mention that if anybody picks up that article out of the description and reads it, just be aware that he does come from the Seventh-day Adventist perspective. But anyway, let's go through his scholarship here. So he says, the Didache, known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, is an early instructional manual dated from the late 1st century to the late 2nd century. Most scholars today are in favor of the earlier date. The statement of interest is found in Codex C, or sometimes called Codex H in some editions. And this is the only surviving complete Greek manuscript of the document. It should be noted here that the substantive day, and he's referring there to the Greek day. If you remember from our original study on Revelation 1:10, the Greek phrase in question is Kyriake Hemera, and his Hemera is the Greek word that's translated day. So he's saying the substantive day does not appear in the text, but rather is supplied by the translators and is rendered on the Lord's day. However, there is no textual evidence that would warrant such a reading of the text, which is an obvious stretch, nor does the context indicate that the Lord's day is intended. Strong evidence suggests, however, that the phrase could rather mean according to the Lord's teaching, according to the Lord's command, or according to the Lord's way. So notice there he says according to the Lord's, and then he believes teaching, command, or way. Now in the last English translation that I read, it said now according to the Lord's, and then they supplied day. So that's really the question. What do we have to supply there after the word Lord's in order to make it make the best sense given the context of what is being discussed? So the next scholar I'm going to go through is E.W. Bullinger. So if anybody was concerned, hey, this first guy was a Seventh-day Adventist, so I'm not real sure about that. Well, Bullinger is probably one of the most furthest from Seventh-day Adventists as you can get. He was a Anglican priest. So he's clearly not going to be trying to prove that we should be worshiping Saturday. As the Anglican priest, he's going to be doing services Sunday. But just notice here the similarities to what he's saying to what Stefanovic said. Like they're in agreement here. And Stefanovic's article, I believe, is from 2010, and Bullinger was writing about the turn of the 20th century, so about 120 years ago. But yet their scholarship is for the most part in agreement. So It doesn't seem like any new discoveries have been figured out since Bullinger to disprove what Bullinger is saying here, at least as far as I know. So Bullinger says, when we turn to the text of the Didache itself, we again look in vain for the word day. We find the adjective lords, and as in the case of Ignatius, we have according to the lords. This is followed by of the Lord, which makes no sense at all. According to the lords of the Lord. Some word or words must evidently be supplied. So let me break in here. And that's why in that first translation I read, that first English option, they supplied day. So they were trying to be literal, and they said, on the Lord's day of the Lord. So that's what Bullinger's addressing here. He said that some word or words must be evidently supplied, for the adjective must qualify a noun expressed or implied. Without such a noun here, we are faced with an insoluble puzzle. If we supply the word day, it is not the usual way of expressing upon or on any day, nor does it make any sense. What are we to understand if we translate the words and on the Lord's day of the Lord? The only suggestion we can make is that we should supply some other noun than day, and take the adjective lords in the sense of imperial as belonging or relating to the Lord, i.e. ruler or emperor. If this sense of imperial may be given to the adjective, as used here in the Didache, we may then supply a noun which makes sense instead of the noun day, which makes no sense. The natural word to supply seems to be command or ordinance. Either of these will be seen to agree with the context. So then Bullinger wants to translate the Didache, that passage in the Didache, as, quote, and according to the imperial command of the Lord, coming together to break bread, etc. So he wants to take the imperial, or the word lords, as being in the sense of imperial, or ruler. Stefanovic didn't want to do that. He wanted to leave lords there, but say according to the Lord's teaching, or something along those lines. So then Stefanovic would still need to address the second part of Bullinger's concern, which at least in the clip I did for this video, I don't recall him addressing that. I think he was moving on. He didn't really spend a whole heck of a lot of time addressing the Didache. Bullinger spent more time critiquing what he thinks is wrong with it. Stefanovic mentioned that the word day isn't found in the text, the Greek text, so we have to translate and supply some word there, and he preferred teaching. So anyway, that's just a difference in how they want to translate it. So Bullinger goes on here. He says, to say according to the Lord's day of the Lord makes no sense at all, and what is more, when the Didache speaks of other days, it always calls them by their number, as the second, fourth, and fifth days, and he cites Didache chapter 8, verse 1. It is true that the first day of the week is in question here in chapter 14, verse 1, but it is the Lord's command or ordinance which is to be observed on that day, and not that day which is so called. So Bullinger's conclusion, the Didache therefore affords no evidence as to the use of the expression the Lord's day for any day of the week. So there we go. That's in an attempt to keep this one much shorter than the hour plus we did on the first part of this. If anybody was concerned that the Didache, that we're required to understand Revelation 1:10 in light of the Didache, well, the Didache does actually not use the same phrase, and it doesn't support, at least in the opinion of Stefanovic, Bullinger, and myself, does not support the understanding of Sunday. So I still believe what I said in part 1, that in Revelation 1:10, John is communicating, I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day, pointing us back to the Old Testament, in that day being one of the ways to designate the day of Yahweh. And we went through all the reasons and details as to why I think that, and why Bullinger thinks that in part 1. So with that, we'll close this one out. Thank you all for listening. God bless. I'll talk to you very soon.